Many of us have probably daydreamed about dating our celebrity crush. For most, it remains just a fantasy, but for a lucky few, those dreams actually come true. Redditors who have dated celebrities, how did it go? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I once dated an actor who starred in an Oscar-nominated movie. At first, he was charming, but he quickly revealed himself to be the most self-centered and insecure person I've ever known. He craved constant attention and praise, calling me at least 5 times a day, always to talk about himself. He'd fish for reassurance about everything, from his looks to his endowment, which, by the way, was average. He'd put himself down as an actor but would get annoyed if I didn't immediately disagree. It was utterly draining, like he was some kind of energy vampire. After a month, I finally called it quits. Story 2. A somewhat close acquaintance of mine went on a few dates with Natalie Portman back in 2002 when they were both at Harvard. He described her as incredibly down-to-earth, genuine, and very engaging. I barely knew the guy, and we only had like a 20-minute conversation about it, from way back. He didn't even bring it up himself. My childhood best friend had to push him to share what little details I remember. Honestly, I don't know much about Natalie Portman, but here's what I do know. She's so damn cool that a guy she briefly dated actually hesitated to even acknowledge it publicly. After all, he lost the girl, so I totally get his hesitation. But that's the kind of humility and maturity this guy had. Pretty cool for someone so young. And in the end, all he got was a few dates with Natalie Portman. That 20-minute story was enough to show me just how incredible she really is. Story 3. I dated a Hollywood actor who took me to a big party, packed with celebrities everywhere. Halfway through the night, he ended up leaving with a Hollywood actress. By then, I'd already met so many celebs that I didn't even care, though I like to say they got to meet me. I got invited to a few more Hollywood parties after that and was honestly shocked to see it was the same crowd every time. Story 4. She was famous in another country and we met when she was visiting friends of mine. We met at a group outing and I had no idea who she was. I asked her out because we clicked and she said yes because she thought I was funny. It wasn't until our third date that I realized she was famous, only because, once or twice, expats from her country recognized her. She was reluctant to explain, but when she finally did, my reaction was just, "Oh, that's cool." I didn't make a big deal about it, which I think helped us stay together. I never showed her off as my celebrity girlfriend because, honestly, I wasn't a fan of her work, and if I had, I think it would have been a deal-breaker. She has a complicated relationship with fame. She didn't enjoy it at all. It was just the price she paid to do something she loved and was great at. When she was in my country, we could be more normal, though fans did approach her now and then. But when I visited her country, we mostly stayed in the hotel or other private places. Eventually, she quietly stepped away from the spotlight and moved to my country. Now, we've been married 7 years, and I'm always on the lookout for any signs that mommy's talents might show up in our kids, lol. Story 5. I was working as a waiter at a high-end restaurant in a Napa winery to pay my way through college. One evening, a group of 10 came in for a special occasion, a 70th birthday dinner for their extremely wealthy grandfather, who I'd served before. Knowing his routine, I had his favorite ashtray waiting at his seat for his after-dinner cigar. At the end of the night, he tipped me generously and praised my work ethic and intelligence. After I thanked him and wished them all a great evening, he turned to his granddaughter and said something like, "Those boys you keep passing up have nothing on a young man like this. In fact, you should bring him to the ball next week. He already knows how to dress and has better taste in wine than that Humphrey fellow who's been eyeing you." The man was used to getting his way. She gave him a polite smile, looked at me with apologetic eyes, and said, "Okay, Grandpa." Her father handed me his card, thanked me for being a good sport, and I exchanged cards with her too, which seemed to surprise her. The ball was a yacht club event, packed with people who could afford yachts bigger than my dorm building and featuring incredible food. She was aware that her life had been far from normal, with her parents being wealthy former celebrities and her grandparents being simply wealthy. The only things we had in common were a taste for chocolate and a mutual attraction to women. I ended the night being dropped off at my dorm in a limo, wearing a tux and slightly tipsy on the limo's single malt. The next time I served her grandfather, I assured him that she would find the right person. A few years later, she came out and is now happily married. She has 12 IMDb credits from before that ball and 31 since. I still see her on screen occasionally. Story 6. Courtney Love flirted with me at a bar in Indianapolis back in 1995. This rather awkward encounter is as close as I can come to contributing to this thread. It was late at night after her concert with Hole at a nearby arena. The moment I walked in, she locked eyes with me, intensely. I actually thought she might hate me for some reason, but she seemed a bit tipsy, so I shrugged it off. She approached me at the bar with two very large guys, who I assume were her security. She ordered me a drink, standing unusually close and touching my shoulder and chest more than once. The whole thing was pretty surreal, and I barely managed to keep up with the conversation. At one point, she mentioned I reminded her of Linus from Charlie Brown. I have no idea what she meant by that, but eventually, I excused myself to the bathroom, and made a quiet exit. This all went down at the Patio, a now-closed nightclub in Broad Ripple. In person, Courtney Love was surprisingly attractive and much shorter than she seems on TV. Not exactly short, but definitely not the 5 feet 9 inches that Google claims. Story 7. She was not a celebrity, but a legitimate model. Back in college, I had a class with this woman who had a striking, exotic look and a bit of a funky vibe. She laughed at my jokes, so we started hanging out. Now I was the classic nerd, glasses, skinny enough to look like a trellis for varicose veins. Meanwhile, she was tall, lean, elegant, with a perfect face and an edgy style. It never crossed my mind there was anything romantic between us. So, imagine my surprise when she asked me out. On our third date, I went over to her place. She mentioned she'd lived in Europe for a few years and had done some modeling. She'd moved back home after her mom passed away and decided to finish her degree. Then she asked if I wanted to see her portfolio. I expected catalog shots. Instead, I found covers from Elle, Italian Vogue, and a bunch of other major fashion magazines. About 10 in total. Turns out, I was dating a cover girl without even realizing it. And to her credit, she never bragged about it. She was always super low-key. I didn't tell anyone because, honestly, I assumed she'd eventually dump me, and I didn't want to look like a fool. Then, one Saturday night, she asked about my plans for Sunday. I mentioned my family's weekly dinner, and she asked, "What time?" So, I warned my family that the girl I was dating would be joining us. My siblings teased me a bit, and my mom was thrilled that I was actually bringing someone around. I kept my dating life to myself since my brothers and sister could be pretty snide. The next day, she arrived at the door in black leather pants, a jacket, some edgy blouse, and a cool early 80s Pat Benatar hairstyle. It was the 80s, after all. When she walked in, you could have heard a pin drop. Dinner lasted a couple of hours, and afterward, I left with her. The next day, my oldest brother said, "So, there's a side of you we didn't know about, huh?" We dated for about 6 months, but honestly, it got exhausting. She was constantly worried about her looks and what she ate, and meals turned into an ordeal. To everyone's surprise, I was the one who eventually let the relationship fade. Story 8. About 8 years ago, I met Corey Feldman at a Comic-Con. He ended up asking me out, but I politely declined. Then he tried to convince me to go to a haunted house with him, which was interesting. I'm way younger than he is. Now, every time my parents see him in a movie, they joke that I could have ended up with a D-list celebrity. Story 9. I went on a date with the daughter of a well-known actor. She'd done a few roles herself. We'd hung out casually a few times, and it seemed like she was growing more interested, so I asked her out. Things went great, we went to a jazz club, then for more drinks afterward, even held hands by the end of the night. When I drove her back to her place, hoping it might lead to something more, she gave me the talk. She said she was interested but wasn't in a place to date, as she was trying to build a career outside of acting and out of her father's shadow. We ended the night with a quick peck on the cheek. The funny part? I was actually supposed to pick her up at her dad's house and was really excited to meet him, but she was running late, so I ended up picking her up from her apartment instead. We stayed friends for a little while, and she even asked me to help her move to a new place, though we never set a date for it. That was the last time we talked, aside from an email she sent about her new acting classes. Story 10. Not me, but my coworker's sister-in-law had a fling with TJ Miller, back in the late 2000s before he made it big in Hollywood and was still doing stand-up on the road. My coworker, his wife, and sister-in-law went to one of TJ's shows, and afterward, TJ and the sister-in-law hit it off. They all ended up back at my coworker's place to hang out, drink, and crash for the night. The next morning, they noticed the front door was open, and a batch of cookies the wife had baked the night before had mysteriously vanished. For years, my coworker would joke about the cookie thief, until he eventually saw TJ on TV and realized it had been him all along. Story 11. I ran into Hugh Jackman on the streets of New York while I was sipping a Pilsner from a paper bag and eating a slice of pizza. I was on my way to see the Violent Femmes at the Roseland Ballroom and, naturally, I asked him to come along. He declined, but I still counted it as a win. I mean, how often do you get to invite Hugh Jackman out? Edited to clarify, I was the one with the beer and pizza. Hugh was just out for a walk. Oh, and that show ended up being the last one ever at the Roseland Ballroom. Story 12. I dated a world-renowned fitness model, and for years afterward, it felt like every time I went to the grocery store, her face would be on the cover of a women's or fitness magazine in the checkout aisle. At one point, I counted at least 8 different covers of one particular magazine she'd graced. I met her at the gym. I was doing a tough baseball training workout on the indoor turf field when I noticed this incredibly fit, beautiful woman also pushing herself hard. I walked over to chat, and we hit it off before going back to our routines. Later, I saw her in the busy free weights area and decided to ask her out. It was one of those moments where I suddenly realized everyone in the gym was watching, and I had no idea why. At the time, I had no clue who she was. The weekend before our first date, she flew out to attend a fitness event. When I texted her, she casually mentioned, "I was busy signing autographs." I still didn't catch on and joked, "Hope your hand doesn't get too tired." She laughed, and it wasn't until later that I realized she wasn't joking. Our time together was amazing. She was incredibly sweet, down-to-earth, and totally feminine. Unfortunately, it was a time in my life when work stress was overwhelming, and I just couldn't keep it all together. It didn't work out, but I still run into her from time to time, and we always share a smile. Story 13. I got set up on a blind date with a very famous dominatrix, famous in her own circle, at least. She was really pleasant, but the restaurant we went to was high-end and ridiculously overpriced. Turns out, she was used to her clients treating her to 5-star spots all the time. We chatted about our jobs and other regular things. By the end of the date, she said she was interested, but I told her that I would never have chosen that place, or the club we went to afterward. She agreed to give it another shot, and we kept it more casual for the second date. I took her to this hole-in-the-wall joint that serves some of the best fried chicken you can imagine. We bar-hopped, checked out some cool secret spots like the backroom bar at Criff Dogs, before it became well-known, and just had a blast. She told me it was the most fun date she'd ever had, but in the end we both realized we were living in 2 very different worlds. Story 14. I wouldn't really call it a date, but here's what happened. I went to a party, ended up bringing this woman home, and things took a turn when she got pretty messed up. Some guys started circling her, noticing she was nodding off, and the creepiest dude there suggested we move her to a bedroom so she wouldn't be disturbed. I might be exaggerating a little, but the whole situation had some pretty sketchy, predatory vibe. The next morning, I made breakfast, and we had a decent conversation. We kind of hit it off, and she ended up staying for 3 days. She was in a fight with her parents and staying at her childhood home. There was sex, but honestly, not as much as you'd think. On the 3rd evening, I went to get us some Jack in the Box. When I came back, she was in the middle of a heated argument. As soon as she saw the food, she grabbed all my mini tacos, my ultimate berry shake, and left without a word. Turns out, she was somewhat of a local celebrity because her dad put her in commercials with him. I had seen her on TV trying to sell hot tubs for years. At the time, those commercials had been running for a while, and she didn't look super familiar, so I didn't make the connection until the end of the second day. Edit. People keep guessing, but I won't confirm if anyone gets it right. No one has yet. Hot tub chick would be in her 40s now. This was quite a while ago. Story 15. We met randomly at a club when he showed up for a surprise performance. I was dancing on stage at the time, and after most of the other girls were asked to leave, I was told to keep dancing. We stayed on stage for a couple of songs after his set, and afterward, he asked me to give him a ride to the studio. He was super down-to-earth, even taking time to sign autographs for fans. The weekend after he left town, he flew me out to his hometown, and we spent about 3 days together. I ended up meeting his mom and sisters during the visit. Before I left, he asked me to stay with him, quit my job, and commit to a relationship, with the catch that I'd have to travel with him non-stop while he promoted his new album. I liked him, but I couldn't risk my financial stability for someone I barely knew. I tried to slow things down, but he took it really personally. Not long after, he wrote a song about me, which made me sound like the bad guy, and it played on the radio constantly for the next few months. I know it was about me because he left a voicemail of him recording it in the studio. Story 16. It was fairly challenging. Her job required a lot of travel, and I couldn't join her due to my own work commitments. She was always faithful, never cheated, even though co-workers and others frequently tried to get her attention. I really respected her for that. We struggled with not being able to plan holidays or do the usual couple things due to our schedules, but overall, it was a good relationship. We actually parted as friends and still keep in touch occasionally. After we broke up, I ended up getting married and was with my wife for 23 years. She and my ex got along well, and my ex always respected our marriage. She's since married and divorced more than once, but has been in a happy relationship for the last 12 years. Her partner is in the industry too, and they're quite a recognized couple, well known though not superstars. Story 17. My wife briefly dated Louis C.K. back in 2012. She always said it seemed pretty tough to be famous. Every time they went out to eat or were in public, they were constantly interrupted or stared at. However, he did come to her birthday party at a small bowling alley in Brooklyn, and he was really down to earth and cool. The story that stands out to me the most is when he went out and bought a $150,000 watch because he was feeling down. Story 18. It wasn't a romantic date at all, but I once had dinner at a Japanese restaurant with Leonardo DiCaprio in a group setting while he was in Louisiana filming Django Unchained. He was curious about college life and asked all of us about our experiences. He even let me try his udon. That was actually my first ever Instagram post. In person, he was genuinely nice and down to earth, just like hanging out with a friend, even though he was a huge star. Story 19. In 1981, my uncle got me tickets to see Foreigner, including 2 backstage passes. I took a girl I really liked, but she ended up meeting Mick Jones and disappearing with him into a dressing room. I didn't see her again the rest of the night. So, I guess you could say Mick Jones kind of ruined my night. Edit. From her side, she said they went into a room where people were drinking and smoking, but he kind of ignored her after that. She stayed for about 20 minutes before leaving and couldn't find me, so she thought I had ditched her. Just to clarify, I'm not suggesting Mick did anything inappropriate. That's just her version of events, and her mom believed it enough to call mine and complain. So, I guess that's how it went down. Story 20. A few years ago, I was heading back to San Diego after my cousin's wedding. I was super hungover and in no mood to deal with anyone as I walked to my gate, silently judging people. Then, I saw this long-haired guy strutting by in a purple button-down shirt and thought, who's this cupcake? Not a comment on his sexuality, just on his shirt color. As he passed, it hit me. Holy shit, that's Fabio. Later, after grabbing a snack, my slightly drunk, very brazen self noticed him sitting at his gate. Without thinking, I just sat down next to him. I looked away for a moment, then turned to him and said, "You're, Fabio?" He coolly replied, "Yes, I am," and shook my hand. We ended up talking for about 30 minutes before he had to leave. He was surprisingly intelligent. We discussed cancer therapies in depth, and I remember thinking, just nod and smile, Fabio is way smarter than you, just nod and smile. Before he left, he asked for my number and texted me the next day to ask me out. Nothing came of it, but I still have his number in my phone. P.S. My dad followed up for weeks to make sure I wasn't dating the man on every romance novel cover. Story 21. My friend's sister-in-law was out for a jog when some random guy came up and started jogging alongside her. They chatted about random things, including the movie being filmed nearby at the time. After a little while, he casually said, "By the way, I hope you like the movie." It wasn't until later that she realized the guy she had been talking to was Harrison Ford. He had been on set for The Force Awakens. Story 22. I had an English teacher who went on a date with Mark Hamill shortly after he filmed Star Wars in the 70s. She described him as a really nice, humble guy. He told her he was just a small-time actor and had recently finished a movie he thought might do well. They only went out once and she never heard from him again. A few months later, she saw him in Star Wars and was absolutely blown away. Story 23. My friend's aunt went on a blind date with Gerard Butler around the time 300 was released. There was a bit of a miscommunication. He was looking for a hookup, and she's a sweet French-Canadian woman in her 50s. Despite the mix-up, they both laughed it off and had a nice dinner together. She said he was incredibly kind and very muscular. Story 24. Probably too late for this, but here goes. About 15 years ago, when The Simple Life with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie was all the rage, I ended up making out with Paris Hilton at a nightclub in Baltimore. They were filming the show, where they did random jobs around the country and stayed with local families for the sake of cultural clash comedy. One of those families was my friend's, and since I was close with them, and a huge fan of Paris at the time, I was invited to hang out with her and Nicole while they were in town. Both were super sweet and way smarter than their on-camera personas let on. Paris was an amazing kisser, and this story still gets me some attention when I tell it. A few months later, Paris's phone was hacked, and her nudes were leaked. My number was in her contacts, and I got bombarded with prank calls from 4chan or something. I imagine it was much worse for anyone actually famous. After that, I lost contact, but it's still a fun story to tell. Story 25. A friend of mine hooked up with Matthew McConaughey. She works as a costumer in Hollywood and was hanging out at the bar at Chateau Marmont when Matt walked up to her and said, "How about you and me walk 30 feet and get open?" Her first reaction was LOL no, but by the end of the night, her friends convinced her to go for it. This was during peak 2000s Matt, when he was ripped and often shirtless. So, she went up to his room, and they hooked up. Apparently, it was sweaty, mostly from behind, and he was into watching them, mostly himself, in the mirror. Same girl also dated McGee from NCIS, and she said he was a total sweetheart. Story 26. Not me, but my uncle dated the singer Pink for a little while in high school. They both went to Central Bucks in Pennsylvania. It's a pretty cool fun fact, but it always gets a bit awkward when it comes up at family gatherings, since he's happily married now. So, no stories to share on my end. From what I hear, she was really chill and down to earth. My uncle was the kind of kid who would make napalm in his backyard and set the neighbor's pool on fire, so I've always imagined she might have been a bit wild too at that time, but I could be totally wrong about that. Story 27. My mom had a dinner date with George Clooney in the 90s. She didn't really say much apart from the fact that he's an interesting and charismatic guy, but she honestly didn't think he was going to blow up. Story 28. One of my dad's close friends is Jim Carrey's first wife. Apparently, he became kind of a jerk after he got famous. Surprising, I know. I remember about a decade ago, when their grown-up kids band was trying to make a career out of their music, she really wanted Jim to help them get bookings and opportunities. But he told her, they need to make it on their own. Then, he got a new girlfriend who encouraged him to help his kid out, and he actually did. His first wife is still pretty salty about it. Story 29. Not exactly a date, but I had a quiet dinner with Samantha Fox in her hotel room in Toronto during the 80s. She was in town for a show, and I was part of her security detail. She invited me to dine with her because she didn't want to go out, but didn't like eating alone. She was a sweet person, though you could tell she felt a bit lonely, almost sad. Edit. I don't remember all the details like what we ate, but I do recall we talked a lot about her childhood in the UK and how she was still in awe of her success. She mentioned how much she looked forward to seeing the world while on tour, but all she ever saw were hotel rooms. She never really got the chance to explore or enjoy being a tourist. Story 30. I have a family friend who dated Daniel Radcliffe when I was 7 years old, and I was a huge Harry Potter fan at the time. I don't remember much from that period, except that he was a really sweet guy. On my 8th birthday, my family friend mentioned it to Daniel, and he actually sent me a personal birthday message, even though we had never met. Completely made my day. Just to clarify, he texted me from my family friend's phone to my mom's phone. Unfortunately, I don't have the message anymore because my mom's texts were deleted when she got a new phone. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I swear on Reddit it's true. Story 31. I dated Flux Pavilion for 7 years, and it was amazing. We got married in January, and while the touring aspect can be tough, I really enjoy my own company, so it's not a big issue for me. To elaborate, it's really special to share my life with someone who's so creatively fulfilled. I love hearing about the new music he's worked on each day when he comes home. I get to travel to some incredible places with him, and it's heartwarming to see how much people appreciate his music. I don't always try to explain his work to new people though, because either they don't understand or they care way too much and only want to talk to me about his music. But overall, it's just a normal, happy marriage. He judges me when I listen to Radio 1, and I judge him when his phone's not on silent. His career isn't a big part of our day-to-day life. I married Josh, not Flux Pavilion. He's an amazing husband for so many reasons, and his musical talent is just one of them. Story 32. This isn't my story, but my aunt dated Weird Al Yankovic when she was in her mid-20s. I wasn't around at the time, but from what my family tells me, he was genuinely funny in a way you wouldn't expect. I don't have any personal examples, but my dad and aunt have tons of stories. One of my much older cousins even has a signed guitar that Al played at a live show. My aunt and Al met through my dad, who was a radio DJ when he was a teenager. He met a lot of celebrities back then, mostly pop and country stars from the 90s and early 2000s. The station my dad worked at threw Weird Al a birthday party, and my aunt just happened to be there. They ended up dating for quite a while. Even though they're no longer together, Al still stops by to say hi whenever he's in town. They're still good friends. And just to clarify, no, Al isn't cheating on his wife with my aunt. My aunt is a strong, married Christian, and there's no way she would do that. Who knows, maybe one day I'll meet him, which I think would be pretty cool. Story 33. I dated a celebrity who was a big deal in her specific genre, though most people probably wouldn't recognize her name. It had its perks, like being moved to the front of the line and always getting great seats wherever we went. But honestly, the attention she got all the time became overwhelming. Beautiful women were constantly throwing themselves at her, messing with her hair and clothes, and touching her. I felt like I could never compete, and it seemed like she could hook up with any one of them whenever she wanted. She also always had to be the center of attention. If she wasn't getting enough, she'd create a scene. I eventually realized she didn't even acknowledge we were dating. She would always say she was single, which explained why she was always surrounded by women. It felt like a game, and I didn't want to play anymore. After we broke up, she started dating a jazz musician who seemed to think she was way more popular than she really was. Watching them out in public trying to outdo each other for attention was almost comical. I honestly couldn't believe they managed to fit both of their egos in the same car. Story 34. I have 3 stories to share. The first one is mine, though it's not that exciting. A few years ago, I met a guy who was the lead singer of a local band at a show. The venue was a bit of a dive. It was in a big storage unit that had been converted, but his band was headlining. After their set, they hung around drinking with the small crowd, maybe about 30 people. I went up to him, told him I really liked their performance, and we ended up chatting for about an hour. We kept in touch for about 4 or 5 months after that. We never officially dated, but we had a good time talking. His band got signed recently and released their first album, and he's now dating a really sweet girl. We're still friends on Facebook, and he recently changed his name and privacy settings, so I kind of feel cool about him keeping me on his list. The second story is similar, but it's about my little sister. She moved to Nashville a couple of years ago for school and met an up-and-coming musician. They hooked up a few times but eventually decided to part ways because he was a couple of years older and didn't want her to get too caught up in him while she was still enjoying college life. He's a good guy and his albums are actually pretty good. The third story is about my mom. She went to an Allman Brothers concert around 1979 or 1980, so she would have been about 20 or 21 at the time. She didn't really know who they were, but her friend invited her, so she went along. After the show, she was standing outside smoking when a guy walked up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. She said he said something like, "You're coming home with me tonight." My mom was like, no I'm not," and turned back to her friend, who seemed kind of starstruck, but my mom didn't know why. The guy stepped around to face her and asked, "Do you know who I am?" My mom replied, "No, and I really don't want to." Then she dropped her cigarette, stamped it out, grabbed her friend, and headed to the bar. Turns out, that guy was Greg Allman. She told me this story a few years ago, and I was floored. I even said, "Mom, I could have been his kid?" And she laughed and told me not to tell Dad. So, yeah, those are a few stories I think fit this thread. Story 35. I dated someone in high school who's now a famous musician. He was really cool, but he wasn't the best boyfriend. He always gravitated toward hanging out with older, cooler people and wasn't very nice to me in public. However, in private, he was sweet and would open up about his insecurities and frustrations. He cheated on me multiple times, and we eventually broke up in college. Looking back, I realize he had a really clear vision of who he wanted to be and how he wanted to be seen, and he chased that relentlessly. I'm sure that drive played a big role in his success. He recently got divorced and sent me some flirty texts out of the blue. I ignored them, though, because I'm happily married and living a normal life now. Story 36. I married the lead singer of my favorite band. While they're only moderately popular in the US now, the band he was in during the late 90s is still pretty well known in Europe. He's down-to-earth, humble, and dating him was always so much fun. I'm an artist, and shortly after we got serious, he helped me out at a convention. He attracted such a crowd that the organizers asked him to wear a costume the next day to avoid safety issues from the crowding in the aisles. Aside from things like that, our life is pretty normal. Story 37. I have 2 stories, both from quite a while ago. The first is about a musician. I almost married him. In private, he was super chill, fun, and loved spending time with me and my kid. He was a bit dorky and sweet, just an average guy. But when we went out and someone approached him, he would flip a switch and suddenly act like the smooth, cool guy. I found out he was cheating and he said it was just part of the job. He had a top song on the Billboard charts when we broke up, and it became so popular that I couldn't go anywhere without hearing it, which would instantly make me mad. We're friends now and keep in touch. I even saw him recently when he was touring in my city and invited me and a friend to his show. The second guy was down to earth, very sweet and normal. I didn't date him for long before I found out he was involved in a high-profile financial crime case. The last time I saw him, he said he was probably going to prison, and just 2 weeks later, he was all over the news. Since then, I've seen documentaries about the case, and it occasionally pops up on crime shows. I met the musician in a bar and the second guy through online dating. There was also another guy, though I'm not sure he counts. I'm not really into political news, but if you are, you might recognize him. He's often an expert commentator on CNN. It didn't last long, just one date. He was sleazy, kept asking for nude pics, and I met him when I was out for dinner with friend. He asked for my number when I was on my way to the bathroom. Story 38. I dated someone who calls himself mildly famous. A few small movies, lots of voice acting, and an active improv group that sells out at conventions. I'm not sure if that counts as famous, but I'll share the story anyway. I met him through friends in the convention scene. I used to do book signings and panels, and cons were my favorite events, way more fun than bookstores. And no, I'm not famous. I've written 3 moderately successful young adult novels and had a few viral Reddit posts, but that's about it. He was, of course, very attractive, charismatic, and hilarious. We had amazing chemistry and got along great. He even left his long-term girlfriend for me. They were in an open relationship, but I'm strictly monogamous. Our relationship was long distance for about a month. It was fun, and nothing negative happened, but looking back, I was surprised by how different his real personality was from his stage persona. It wasn't a bad thing, just a bit strange. The real reason I ended it was because he was moving way too fast for me. After just a couple of weeks, he was already talking about me moving in with him. It felt intense, and I wasn't ready for that. Thankfully, he took it well. He found his soulmate soon after, and they've been happily married for a few years now. I've moved on as well, but we're still friends online. I think I've found my non-famous soulmate now too, fingers crossed. Story 39. He's a B-list actor/entertainer in the US with just under 1 million followers on Instagram. We casually dated long distance for a while since he traveled a lot. I met him while vacationing in another city where he was working. We chatted briefly with me and a friend, and it felt surreal since I'd grown up watching him on TV and had even seen him perform when he was on tour in my city. He asked for my number, and I didn't think I'd hear from him again. But he called nearly every day. I mostly ignored him at first because I didn't trust him, assuming he had a lot of women in his life. Months later, he came to my city, and we spent the whole weekend hanging out. It was fun. People recognized him when we were out, and some women flirted with him and asked for photos, with me taking the pic. He was respectful to me, though nice to his fans too. I'm pretty private and low-key, so I wasn't crazy about the attention. Meanwhile, he got tons of DMs from women hoping to get his attention and maybe more followers on Instagram. I'm not even on social media, so it was a bit strange. We kept in touch, meeting in my city or his a few more times, and he called me nearly every day. But I started getting turned off by his public persona after hearing him on a few podcasts. I could tell I was probably one of many, and he seemed pretty over the top. I distanced myself, and he tried to convince me not to believe everything he said online, which I wasn't buying. He eventually asked me to join him on some of his travels, but I told him I wanted a real, non-long-distance relationship. He didn't seem to accept that and still reached out frequently. Then I met someone new in my city. When I told him I was in a relationship and couldn't keep in touch or visit him anymore, he didn't take it well. He tried to convince me to cheat and travel with him, but I declined. A little while later, he was in my city for work and begged me to meet him, but I refused. I eventually told my boyfriend about it, and he flipped out, picking fights and being aggressive. I think he had Googled the guy and was feeling insecure. We broke up the next day, and while I probably shouldn't have brought it up, we were having issues anyway. Both the actor and my ex kept contacting me after that, and I ended up blocking them both. That was a couple of years ago. I'm still single and dating, but doing a much better job of avoiding controlling or insecure men. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.